There is a kind of silence that only exists in Amish country. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something being held back. The kind of quiet that settles over a farm at dusk when everyone is watching the same horizon and nobody is saying what they're actually thinking. That's the silence Hannah Stoltzfus grew up inside, and for 18 years she never once questioned it. Until the summer, everything changed. Hannah was the bishop's daughter. In their community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that meant something. It meant people noticed when she walked into Sunday service. It meant the older women watched her hands when she hung laundry, checking that her dress was the right length, that her cap was pinned right, that she was becoming the kind of woman a good Amish man would want beside him. It meant her father's eyes were always on her, even when he was looking somewhere else. Especially then. Bishop Eli Stoltzfus was not a cruel man. She would tell you that herself, even later, even after everything that happened. He was firm the way old wood is firm, not because someone made it that way, but because decades of bearing weight had pressed all the softness out. He loved his daughter in the way the community understood love, through expectation, through discipline, through keeping her safe inside the fence of everything he believed was right. And Hannah loved him back. That's the part that makes this story so painful. She wasn't running from something she hated. She was being pulled towards something she didn't yet have a name for. It started on a Tuesday morning in late June. The Miller's farm, 3 properties east, needed extra hands for haying season. It wasn't unusual Amish families helped each other that way, shared labor like shared bread. Hannah went with her mother and 2 younger sisters. The men from neighboring farms came too, and with them came the work crew from the English side of the county line. He was standing near the fence when she first saw him. Tall, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead by the summer heat, wearing a gray t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was holding a thermos and talking to one of the Miller boys, laughing at something. Easy laughter. The kind that didn't need permission. His name was Daniel Marsh. He was 22. He'd grown up 2 miles outside the community boundary, the son of a man who sold farm equipment to both English and Amish families. He knew the county, he knew the rules, or thought he did. Hannah saw him and looked away. That was the right thing to do. But then he looked at her, and he smiled. Not the careful, respectful nod that Amish men gave. A real smile. Like she was just a person standing in a field on a summer morning, and that was enough reason to be glad. She didn't smile back. She turned and carried her basket toward the house. But she thought about that smile for 3 days. If this story is already pulling at something in you, subscribe for more real emotional stories like this one. Because this is only the beginning. The thing about Amish life that people on the outside often misunderstand is this. It isn't a prison. Nobody is locked in. The community exists because people choose it, or at least they're supposed to. Rumspringa exists precisely because the founders of the faith believed that a choice made freely is worth more than one made out of ignorance. Young people are supposed to see the world, and then come home. Hannah had never taken Rumspringa seriously. Some kids left, some drank, some drove cars, some disappeared into cities and came back changed or didn't come back at all. Hannah had watched all of that from the edge of her father's porch, and none of it had ever called to her. She knew what she was, she knew where she belonged, or she thought she did. She saw Daniel again 4 days later, at a produce stand outside the Miller property. He was loading wooden crates into a truck bed. He saw her coming down the road with her mother, and he nodded that same easy acknowledgement, like he was just being decent. Her mother didn't notice. Hannah kept her eyes forward, but she slowed her steps just slightly, just enough to hear if he said something. He didn't. He just went back to loading the crates, and somehow that bothered her more than if he had spoken. She started noticing things after that. The truck parked near the Miller's barn on Thursday mornings. The sound of an English radio drifting across a field when the wind was right, music she didn't know, but that sat in her chest long after she'd walked past. Small things, ordinary things that shouldn't have mattered, but they kept arriving in the back of her mind like birds that won't leave a windowsill. In early July, there was a community gathering at the Yoder farm, a barn raising, which meant the whole community came, men with tools, women with food, children running between everyone's legs. It was the kind of day Hannah usually loved. The feeling of everyone moving together toward one purpose, her father in his black coat shaking hands, accepting the responsibility of his position with the quiet dignity that had always made her proud. She was carrying a tray of sandwiches when she heard Daniel's voice. He was there because the Yoders had hired his father's company to deliver materials. He wasn't supposed to stay. English workers generally delivered and left. But old Jacob Yoder had offered the crew lunch, and Daniel had stayed behind while the others drove back. He was sitting at the edge of the gathering, on a fence post, eating a sandwich and watching the barn going up with what looked like genuine admiration. She almost walked past him. She should have walked past him. How do they do it so fast, he asked. Not to anyone specifically, just out loud. She stopped. Everyone knows their part, she said. Then immediately wished she hadn't. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the tray. You were at the Miller farm last week, he said. A lot of people were. I know. I just remembered you specifically. She walked away. Her face was warm. She told herself it was the July heat. There are moments in a life that you don't recognize as turning points until much later. You don't feel the ground shifting. You just feel the warmth of an ordinary afternoon, the weight of a tray in your hands, the sound of hammers and men calling out to each other, and somewhere underneath all of that, something has already changed direction. Hannah Stoltzfus was not a girl who broke rules. She never had been. She kept her cap straight. She helped her mother without being asked. She attended every Sunday service and every Wednesday singing, and sat with her hands folded the way the older women had taught her. She was good. She genuinely wanted to be good. That's what made what happened next so hard to explain, even to herself. 3 weeks after the barn raising, she was at the edge of her father's property, pulling weeds from the garden, a job she'd done 1,000 times when she heard a truck slow down on the road. She didn't look up. Then she heard a door. Excuse me. Daniel Marsh was standing at the edge of the fence. He was holding something. Your neighbor's dog got into something. I think it's a Miller dog. I didn't know whose it was. It was an old hound. She recognized it immediately. She stood up, brushed her hands on her apron, and walked to the fence to take the dog's rope lead. Their hands didn't touch. She was very aware of that. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. He didn't leave right away. He looked out at the garden. That's a big garden. We have a big family. How many? She hesitated. There was no rule against talking to an English person. There was no rule against being polite. 6 children. I'm the oldest. He nodded. That's a lot of work. It's just life, she said. And then before she could stop herself, isn't yours? He smiled that same smile. Fair enough. She took the dog and walked back toward the barn. She could feel him watching. She kept her back straight and her steps even, and she did not turn around. That night she lay awake for a long time listening to her sisters breathe in the dark and asking herself what exactly she was doing. The answer she kept arriving at frightened her. She didn't know. Comment below what would you have done in her position. August came heavy and golden over the county. The corn was tall. The days smelled of cut grass and warm wood and something Hannah couldn't name that seemed to live in the hours between chores. She told herself she wasn't thinking about Daniel Marsh, and then she would catch herself calculating which day of the week it was and whether his father's crew had any deliveries scheduled near the Millers. She was ashamed of this. Truly deeply ashamed. But the shame wasn't enough to make her stop. The first time they talked for more than 2 minutes, it was an accident. Or at least that's what she told herself. She'd gone to the small library branch in the nearby town to return books her father allowed it, had always encouraged reading, considered it a way to understand the world without being absorbed by it. She was standing at the return desk when Daniel walked in behind her. He recognized her before she recognized him. Hannah, he said, and then immediately, I'm sorry, I don't know if I should use your name. That surprised her, that he'd thought about it, that he knew enough to wonder. It's fine, she said. They ended up at adjacent sections of shelves. She was looking for a book on medicinal herbs. He was returning something about local history. They talked for 11 minutes. She counted later, the way you count something you know you're going to have to account for. He asked her what she was reading. She told him. He said he didn't know anything about herbs but that his grandmother had kept a garden, and that the smell of rosemary still made him feel like he was 7 years old. It was such a small thing to say, such a human thing to say. She thought about it for the rest of the day. He didn't ask her any of the questions English people usually asked. He didn't ask if she missed television or whether she'd ever wanted to leave or what it felt like to dress that way. He just talked to her the way you talk to someone you're interested in, simply and carefully, like her answers mattered. Nobody had ever talked to her exactly like that. She went home and helped her mother with supper, and listened to her father discuss a dispute between 2 community families over a property line, and she nodded and passed the bread and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She had been trained by her whole life to hold things in, but that night she let herself think one true thing. Alone in the dark, she wanted to talk to him again. And then she closed that thought like a door and pressed her back against it. It was her younger sister who first noticed. Rebecca was 16, sharp-eyed the way youngest children often are, having spent their whole lives watching everyone older than them for cues about how the world worked. She came into the kitchen one evening where Hannah was churning butter and said, simply, "Who is he?" Hannah didn't look up. "Who is who?" "Whoever is making you look like that." "Like what?" "Like you're somewhere else." The churning didn't slow. "I don't know what you're talking about, Beck." Rebecca watched her for a moment longer, then said, "Okay," in a voice that meant she absolutely knew. Hannah churned the butter too long that evening, and it came out wrong. She had to throw it out, and she stood over the waste bin for a long moment with her jaw tight and her hands still, and she thought, this has to stop. Whatever this is, it has to stop right now, before it becomes something that can't be undone. She believed that, she meant it, and then September came, and everything she meant to do fell apart. Subscribe now, because what happens next is the part this story has been building toward, and you need to be here for it. The county held its annual harvest auction in early September, a large open-air event that mixed English and Amish vendors and buyers in the easy commerce that had always existed at the edges of both communities. Her father went every year. The whole family went. It was one of the few places where worlds overlapped openly, and nobody was ashamed of it. Hannah was helping her mother at their table preserves, quilted goods, dried herbs when she saw Daniel across the yard. He was with a group of English men, looking at a piece of equipment. He hadn't seen her yet. She had a choice. She could stay at the table. She could keep her eyes down. She could be the bishop's daughter, which was who she was, which was who she had always been. She stayed at the table, but 20 minutes later, carrying empty jars back to the wagon, she turned a corner between stalls and nearly walked directly into him. They both stopped. 1 foot between them. "Hannah," he said, and then, quickly glancing around, "I'm sorry, I didn't see you." "Neither did I." Her voice was steady. She was good at steady. "How are you?" "Fine. You?" "Good." He shifted the box he was carrying. He seemed uncertain in a way she hadn't seen before. "I've been wondering, and you can tell me to stop. This is probably a bad idea, but I was wondering if you'd want to just walk around and look at the auction, together, for a few minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father at the far end of the yard. She thought about Rebecca's eyes. She thought about 11 minutes in a library. "For a few minutes," she said. They walked for 40. She told herself it was just the crowd, the way people got separated, the way a conversation could continue without it meaning anything. She told herself a dozen things, and none of them were quite true. He listened to her. That was the thing she kept coming back to, not just waited for her to finish speaking, listened. When she talked about the garden, or the preserves, or the way the light changed over the fields in September, he was genuinely interested. He asked questions that showed he'd heard the last thing she'd said, and was building on it. At some point she realized she'd been laughing. A real laugh. She hadn't noticed it arrive. Then her mother appeared at the edge of her vision, looking for her, and everything in Hannah's body went cold. "I have to go," she said. "I know." He didn't try to stop her. "Hannah, is it all right if I say that I hope I see you again?" She didn't answer. She walked away. But the question lived inside her like a coal, warm and dangerous, for days. Her father noticed something that evening. Not what it was he couldn't have known, but he noticed the change in the air around her. The way a man who has spent decades reading his community can feel a shift in someone he loves before they've done anything visible to cause it. He didn't ask her directly. Bishop Eli Stoltzfus never came at things directly. He came at them sideways, through principle and scripture, and the careful application of the weight he carried. That Sunday, he preached about temptation. Not fire and brimstone temptation, he wasn't that kind of preacher. He talked about the subtlety of it, about how it rarely appeared as something obviously wrong, how it came disguised as something that felt natural, even kind, how the heart could be deceived precisely because it was good and trusting. Hannah sat in the women's section and kept her eyes on her lap and felt every word land. Afterward, one of the older women, Ruth Byler, who had known Hannah since she was born, put a hand on her shoulder. "You look pale," she said. "Are you well?" "Just tired," Hannah said. "Are you well?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were old and they had seen things. "A girl like you has to be careful," she said quietly. Not unkindly. "There's a lot that can be taken from you without you even realizing you've given it." Hannah smiled and thanked her and went to help with the food. And she stood at that table and served food for 2 hours, and smiled at everyone who came through the line and felt something in her chest like a fist slowly closing. She didn't go to the library the following week, or the week after. She threw herself into work the way she always had, into the rhythm of farm life, the honest exhaustion of it, the way it could crowd out anything that didn't belong. She churned butter correctly. She sewed carefully. She read scripture before bed and let the words lie over the surface of her thoughts like a blanket. It almost worked. Then on a Wednesday in late September, a letter arrived. It was not a long letter. It was not a romantic letter in any obvious sense. It was written on plain notebook paper in handwriting that was clear and unpretentious, and it said, "I know this might be wrong to send. I'm sorry if it is. I'm not trying to cause you any trouble. I just wanted to say that I thought our conversation at the auction was the best conversation I've had in a long time, and I'm not sure what to do with that. You don't have to respond. I'll understand." It was signed with just his name. She read it in the barn, alone, while her sisters were in the house. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it very small and put it in the pocket of her apron. She should have burned it. She knew that. She did not burn it. Hannah kept that letter for 9 days. She carried it with her the way you carry something you're afraid to set down because you're afraid of what setting it down means. She took it out twice and read it and then folded it again. She told herself she was deciding what to do. She was not deciding. She was delaying. On the 10th day she found a piece of paper and sat down at the small writing table in the corner of the bedroom she shared with her sisters, very late at night, and she wrote back. She wrote 3 drafts. The first 2 she tore into small pieces and hid in her apron to dispose of in the morning. The third one said, "I thought it was the best conversation I've had in a long time too. I don't know what to do with that either." She mailed it at the post office in town when she went for supplies. And then she came home and sat in the garden for an hour, breathing in the September air, feeling something she recognized as both joy and dread running through her at the same time, unable to separate one from the other. If you feel what she's feeling right now, leave a like, because this is the moment everything becomes impossible to take back. They wrote letters for 6 weeks. It was so old-fashioned that it would have been funny if it hadn't felt so serious. He wrote to her about his work, about the county, about a book he was reading on the history of Lancaster farmland going back 200 years. She wrote to him about the seasons, about her family, about the small theological questions that had always lived in the back of her mind and that she'd never said out loud to anyone. She had never said them out loud because there was no one in her life she'd trusted to hear them without flinching. Questions like, what does it mean to choose a faith you were born into? Is that really a choice at all? Questions like, if God made me with a mind that wants to understand things, is it wrong to use it? She'd buried those questions for years under layers of duty and routine, and now here she was, writing them down on paper, and putting them in an envelope, and mailing them to a man she'd spoken to 5 times, and the terrifying thing was that it felt more honest than anything she'd done in years. He answered carefully. He didn't pretend to have answers. He said things like, I don't know, but I think the question itself means something, and that matters. He told her that his grandmother, the same one with the rosemary garden, had been a woman of very strong faith, who also asked hard questions her whole life, and that the 2 things had coexisted in her without apology. He said, I don't think doubt is the opposite of faith. I think indifference is. She read that line 4 times. She didn't agree with everything he said. Sometimes she wrote back pushing against his reasoning carefully, respectfully, but pushing. And he pushed back, not to win, but to think. They had arguments in those letters, real ones, that left her energized in a way she hadn't felt since she was a child, learning to read and discovering that words could do things she hadn't known were possible. He was careful in other ways too. He never asked her to meet him. He never said anything that could have been read as pressure or invitation. He just kept showing up in that small rectangular way, ink on paper saying, I'm here, and I'm listening. And she kept writing back, because she was not ready to be done being known. In October she began to understand that she was in love with him. She fought the understanding the way you fight something you already know is true, by telling yourself it was something smaller. Gratitude, she said to herself. Admiration. The novelty of a different kind of conversation. She was very persuasive with herself, and for about 10 days she almost believed it. Then one evening she was mending a shirt at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, her sisters already asleep, thinking about something he'd written in his last letter, something small, about the way the fields looked in October fog, and she caught herself smiling with her whole face in the empty kitchen. She stopped. She looked at her own hands on the shirt. She didn't let herself use the word for another 2 weeks after that. She was too honest to use a word she didn't mean, and she was too frightened to use a word that meant something this large. But there it was. She was in love with Daniel Marsh. She was the bishop's daughter. She was the girl who had never once wanted to leave. She was the girl who sat with her hands folded and her eyes down, and her whole life arranged neatly around the shape of what she was supposed to be, and she was in love with an English boy. And the worst part, the part that kept her staring at the ceiling long after everyone else was asleep, was that it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the truest thing she'd felt in her life. And she didn't know what to do with that. A mistake you can correct. The truth just sits there and waits. The first time they met deliberately was on a Thursday afternoon in late October, at a small covered bridge that sat at the edge of both properties, not quite Amish land, not quite English, the kind of border place that belonged equally to neither world. She'd told her mother she was walking to the Yoders to deliver a quilt. She walked to the Yoders. She delivered the quilt. And on the way back she turned down the path to the bridge. He was there. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee in a thermos because he'd remembered from her letters that she drank it in the morning. She accepted the cup. They stood at the railing and looked at the creek and talked the way you talk when you've been writing to someone for weeks, picking up threads, filling in the spaces between written words. At some point she said, "This is dangerous." She meant it practically, not dramatically. "I know," he said, "I don't know what I'm doing. Neither do I honestly. That doesn't help." He turned to look at her. "I know it doesn't. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to make your life complicated, Hannah. I genuinely don't want to hurt you." She believed him. That was the problem. It would have been simpler if she didn't. They stood at that bridge for an hour. When she left, he didn't follow her or ask when he'd see her again. He just watched her go. She made herself not look back. She went home and sat with her family at supper, and listened to her father talk about the upcoming district meeting, and her little brother Thomas spilled his milk, and her mother scolded him gently. And everything was so normal, so perfectly and achingly normal, that something in Hannah's throat tightened until she had to excuse herself and go to the outhouse just to breathe. She loved this life. She needed to remember that. She loved this life. But she was also counting the days until she could stand at that bridge again. It was Rebecca who found the letters. She wasn't snooping, or that's what she said. She'd been looking for a piece of ribbon she thought she'd left in the drawer of the writing table, and the letters were there, 6 of them, tied with a piece of thread and tucked under a Bible. Hannah came into the room to find Rebecca sitting on the bed with the letters in her lap and a look on her face that was more scared than angry. "Beck, who is Daniel Marsh?" It wasn't a question. Hannah felt the floor tilt slightly. "Give those to me, Hannah." Rebecca stood up. She was shaking. "Is this an Englishman? Is this who you've been? Keep your voice down." Hannah crossed the room and took the letters. Her hands were steady. She was always steady on the outside. "This is not what you're thinking." "Then what is it?" Hannah couldn't answer. The silence stretched between them like something about to snap. "Are you in love with him?" Rebecca asked. She looked like she was going to be sick. "Are you in love with an English?" "Rebecca, Papa will don't." Hannah grabbed her sister's arm. Not hard, just firmly enough to stop the word that was coming. "Don't say anything to Papa. Please, please, Beck." Rebecca stared at her. Her eyes were filling. "What are you doing, Hannah? What are you doing? He'll shun you. He won't have a choice. You're his daughter, but he's the bishop. He'll have to." "I know." Hannah's voice broke on those 2 words. Just slightly. Just for a second. "I know what he'd have to do." The sisters stood there in the small bedroom for a long time. Outside, their brothers were doing evening chores. Their mother was in the kitchen. Their father was reading scripture in his chair by the window, the way he did every evening. Finally Rebecca said, in a very small voice, "Are you going to stop?" Hannah looked at the letters in her hands. "I should. That's not an answer." "No," Hannah said quietly. "It isn't." Rebecca didn't tell their father. At least, not right away. But something changed between the sisters after that evening. A heaviness, the kind that comes when someone knows something they've agreed not to say, and the weight of the agreement presses down on both of them. Rebecca watched Hannah with frightened eyes. Hannah watched Rebecca with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. November came and brought the cold. She met Daniel at the bridge twice more. Each time she went knowing she shouldn't. Each time she came back knowing she'd go again. The second time, in early November, she arrived to find him already there, leaning against the railing, with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the creek run dark under a low sky. He had a thermos again. He handed it to her without being asked. She took it and stood beside him, and they were quiet for a while, which was something they'd gotten comfortable with, silence that didn't demand to be filled. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. Do you ever actually want to leave? Not because of me, just for yourself." She thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. Sometimes, she said, not to go somewhere specific, just to know what it feels like to not be watched. He was quiet a moment. "Who watches you?" "Everyone," she said, not unkindly, but everyone. I'm the bishop's daughter. That means something here. It means people are always measuring whether I'm what I should be. And are you? She almost laughed. Probably not. Right now, standing here, definitely not. He didn't say anything to that. He looked at the water. What about you? She said. What do you want from this? And be honest. I'd rather know the hard thing than the comfortable one. He turned to look at her. He took a moment before he spoke, which she'd come to understand meant he was being careful, not evasive. I want to keep talking to you, he said. I want to know how you think about things. I want to show you things and hear what you make of them. He paused. And I'm aware that wanting all of that might be entirely unfair to you, and I don't know how to resolve that. She looked at him for a long time. That's the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me. That can't be true. The people in my life are honest about rules, she said, about expectations, about what God wants and what the community needs. But nobody is very honest about what they actually want. She looked back at the creek, including me. Until recently. They talked for 2 hours that evening. About everything: her doubts, her faith, the parts of her life that were genuinely beautiful, and the parts that felt like walls she'd never thought to question. He listened in the way she'd come to need, not waiting for her to finish, but actually following, actually there. At one point she said something she'd never said aloud to anyone, that sometimes in Sunday service, she felt the presence of God very clearly, like a warmth that had nothing to do with the building or the words. And other times she sat in the same room and felt nothing at all, and didn't know if that meant the feeling was real, or if she'd just gotten better at performing it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think that's one of the most honest things about faith I've ever heard. It might be one of the most dishonest things about me. Maybe both can be true. The third meeting came on an evening in mid-November, when the first real snow had fallen. She almost didn't go. She stood at the kitchen window for 20 minutes watching the snow come down, telling herself there was no reason to go, telling herself the cold was too much, telling herself that every time she went it only made the rest of her life harder to inhabit. She went anyway. He was there. Cold. He had walked from the English side, which was further. His jacket had snow on the shoulders. They stood at the railing and watched the creek run under a thin shelf of ice at its edges, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Then he said, I've been trying to figure out what's fair to you, and I keep arriving at the same place. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you tell me to stop writing, I'll stop. If you tell me you're staying and you're done with this, I'll believe you. But Hannah. He stopped. What? I don't want to stop knowing you. That's the honest thing. He looked at her with those clear, direct eyes. I know that's not simple. I know it maybe doesn't help you. But you've been honest with me and I want to be honest with you. She stood in the snow and felt the cold and thought about her father in his chair, and Rebecca's frightened eyes and the letters folded under the Bible and the life she'd been given, which she loved, which she genuinely loved, and she thought, I am going to have to make a choice, and whichever one I make, something is going to be lost forever. She'd known that for weeks, but standing in the snow that evening, she let herself feel it fully for the first time. It was heavier than she'd expected, and it didn't go away when she walked home. It came with her right through the front door, and sat down across from her at the supper table, and watched her eat with her family in the warm kitchen, and she wondered if this was what it felt like to carry something for the rest of your life. The thing nobody talks about when they tell these stories, the thing that gets left out, is how long the ordinary goes on right next to the impossible, how you can be carrying something this large, and still go home and set the table and eat supper, and let your little brother show you the cat he's made friends with in the barn, and feel genuinely glad about the cat. How life doesn't pause to let you have your crisis cleanly. Hannah kept going. She kept being the bishop's daughter. She kept being the oldest sister and the careful one, and the one who always knew the right words for the right moment. She kept being good, and underneath all of that the question that had no good answer kept turning and turning in the dark. December arrived. The district meeting her father had been preparing for was coming. There were 2 matters before the community, a question about the use of certain farm machinery, and the question of a young man named Aaron Lapp who had come back from Rumspringa and was seeking to be received back into membership. Her father had been consulting with the other ordained men for weeks. She watched him carry the weight of it. Aaron Lapp was 24. He'd left 3 years ago, not quietly like some did, but with a kind of visible desperation, like a man running from a fire. He'd left behind a girl who had waited for him for 2 years and then married someone else. He'd come back different, thinner in the face, with a stillness to him that hadn't been there before. Whether that stillness was peace or damage, nobody could quite agree. Hannah had known Aaron since they were children. She watched him at the district meeting from across the room, sitting very straight, answering the ordained men's questions in a clear voice. His eyes kept going to the floor between answers and then coming back up. She knew that feeling. Looking at the floor while someone decides what you are worth. Her father asked him, in front of everyone, the question they always asked, was he prepared to live according to the Ordnung, to submit to the community, to put aside what the world had offered him, and return fully to what he had been called to? And Aaron said yes. His voice didn't waver. He said yes and meant it, she thought, or was trying very hard to mean it. Sometimes, she thought, those are the same thing. The community accepted him back. There was quiet rejoicing. Food appeared from somewhere. The ordinary closing warmth of a community that believed in second chances, provided those chances ended in the right place. Hannah watched her father shake Aaron's hand. She watched Aaron's face relief, but underneath it something that would take years to fully name. The cost of having been gone. The cost of having come back. Both things true at once. She knew what it cost him to be what he was. She had always known, and she loved him for it. Which made everything worse. The night before the district meeting, her father called her to sit with him in the front room, just the two of them. Her mother found reasons to be elsewhere, which meant her mother knew something. Her father sat in his chair, and she sat in the one across from him, and he looked at her for a long time without speaking. His beard had gone completely gray in the last 2 years. She'd watched it happen. His hands on his knees were the hands of a man who had worked a farm for 40 years. "Hannah," he said, "you're my eldest, you know what that means to me." "Yes, Papa. I've tried to raise you right. Your mother has tried." He paused. "I don't think we've failed. I think you are a good person. But I think something is pulling at you, and I don't think you've told me what it is." She felt the blood leave her face. "I'm not accusing," he said quietly. "I'm asking, as your father, not as the bishop." He looked at her steadily. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She sat in that chair, and she looked at her father's face, and she made a calculation in 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. If she told him, the letters would end, Daniel would be gone, and she would stay. If she didn't tell him, she would continue to carry this, and it would grow, and eventually it would come out in some worse way. In some way she couldn't control. And there was a third thing. A thing she had been circling for weeks, unable to land on it. She wasn't sure she wanted to stay. Not because of Daniel, or not only because of Daniel, but because standing at that bridge in the snow, talking about things she'd never talked about with anyone, she had discovered that there were parts of her that had never had room to exist inside the shape she'd been given, and she didn't know what to do with that. "Papa," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. "I think I need to tell you something." His expression didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly on his knees. "Then tell me," she told him. Not everything, not the bridge in the snow, or the way she felt when he said her name. But she told him she had been corresponding with an Englishman she'd met at the Miller farm, that it had gone further than it should have, that she was confused and frightened and she didn't know what she was asking for. Her father sat still for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful in the way that meant he was managing something large underneath it. "Do you understand what you're telling me? Do you understand that I have an obligation not just as your father, but as the man this community has trusted to keep it?" "I know, Papa. This cannot continue." He said it quietly, with tremendous weight. "Whatever it is, it cannot continue. You know why?" "I know, Hannah." His voice shifted just barely, just for a moment into something that was only a father and not a bishop at all. "Does he know who you are? What it would mean?" "He knows," she said. "He's never asked me to leave." Something moved through her father's face that she couldn't fully read. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated. "Then he's either very foolish," her father said, "or he's better than I want him to be." She hadn't expected that, she didn't know what to do with it. He stood up. The conversation was over, or that part of it was. "I want the letters," he said. "All of them. Tomorrow morning." She nodded. She went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the house breathe and thought about the letters under the Bible, and about her father's face when he'd said what he'd, and about Daniel standing in the snow saying, "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." She cried once, quietly, into her pillow. Then she stopped. She did not give her father the letters. She spent all of the next morning telling herself she would. She went to the drawer twice. Both times she walked away. The second time she stood with her hand on the drawer handle for a full minute, and she thought about Aaron Lapp's face the night before, that look of relief and cost, sitting side by side, and she thought, is that what I want? To close this door and stand on this side of it forever, and have it be settled? She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know. That afternoon she wrote Daniel one last letter. She sat at the kitchen table while her mother was in the garden, and her sisters were at the Yoders, and she wrote it fast because fast meant honest. It said, "My father knows. I don't know what happens now. I think this is the end of what we were doing. I don't want it to be. I don't know what that means. I don't know what I'm asking for. I don't know if I have the right to ask for anything." She signed it with her name and nothing else. She mailed it on her way to return a borrowed pot to the Yoders. When she came home, her father was waiting on the porch. He'd spoken to Ruth Byler that morning, who had mentioned she'd seen Hannah speaking with an English man at the auction in September. Her father's face was very still, the kind of still that meant he had been thinking about something for hours and had arrived somewhere. "Where are the letters?" he said. "I gave them," she said. The lie arrived before she could stop it. She had never lied to her father in her life, not once, not about anything that mattered. And the worst thing, the thing she kept coming back to later, was the ease of it. It came out smooth and clean, as if she'd been practicing, as if some part of her had been preparing it without her permission. He looked at her for a long time. "Are you telling me the truth?" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then it's done, and we won't speak of it again." He went inside. She stood on the porch in the December cold and felt the lie sitting in her like a swallowed stone, heavy and wrong and permanent. She thought about the person she had been a year ago, the girl who kept her cap straight and her hands steady, and told herself she was good. She thought about whether that person was still here, or whether she had walked away somewhere back in June, and nobody had told her yet. She didn't have an answer. She just had the cold, and the lie, and the stone of it inside her. She stood there until the cold was too much. Then she went inside and started supper. Rebecca found her in the barn that evening. She didn't say anything for a while. She just sat on the hay beside her sister, in the dim light, listening to the horses shift and breathe. Then she said, "Did you tell him?" "Yes, all of it?" "Enough." Rebecca was quiet. "What are you going to do?" Hannah looked up at the barn ceiling. The old wood, dark with decades. The smell she'd known her whole life. "I don't know," she said, and for once in her life she didn't pretend otherwise. "Do you love him?" Rebecca asked. Her voice was very small. "Yes." The word came out without hesitation. It surprised both of them. Rebecca made a sound that might have been a cry, quickly swallowed. She reached out and took Hannah's hand and held it hard in the dark of the barn, and they sat like that for a long time, two sisters on the edge of something that was going to change both their lives, no matter what happened next. January. The cold had settled hard over the county. The fields were white. The horse's breath made clouds in the barn in the mornings. Life narrowed to the warm spaces, the kitchen, the sitting room, the circle of lamplight at the writing table where she'd spent so many nights now doing the thing she wasn't supposed to be doing. Daniel's response arrived 12 days after she'd mailed her letter. She'd had it rerouted to the post office box she'd opened in October with money she'd saved from selling preserves, a detail she hadn't told anyone, a small practical lie layered under the larger emotional one, and every layer of it pressed down on her at night. She retrieved it herself, on a Thursday, on the way back from the feed store. She sat in the cold behind the post office building, in the narrow gap between the wall and the dumpster where no one would see her, and she opened it with fingers that had gone numb. His handwriting was steady. "It always was," he wrote. "I've been thinking about what's fair to say and what isn't. I think you know how I feel. I don't want to use that to pull you somewhere you don't want to go, but I want you to know if you ever needed somewhere to go, you'd have one. That's not a pressure, that's just a door being held open. What you do with it is yours." And then at the bottom, in smaller writing, like he'd added it after he thought he was done, "I hope you're warm. I hope your family is well. I hope you're asking your questions even when there's no one around to answer them." She sat behind the post office in the January cold and read that last line 3 times. She thought about the person who would think to write that, the specific kindness of it, the way it was aimed precisely at her, not at the situation or the complication or the thing between them, but at her, at who she actually was. She folded the letter and held it in her hands for a long time, a door being held open. She thought about her father's chair and her mother's kitchen and Rebecca's hand in the dark barn. She thought about the sound of hammers at a barn raising and Sunday service, and the exact smell of her community's meeting house in winter, cold wood and candle smoke, and the feeling of 100 people all choosing the same thing together, all breathing the same air. She thought about 11 minutes in a library and 40 minutes at a harvest auction and a thermos of coffee on a bridge in the first snow, and a letter that ended, "I hope you're asking your questions." Both things were real. Both things were hers, and she was going to have to choose. She sat behind the post office until her feet went numb. Then she stood up, put the letter in her coat pocket, and walked home. She didn't tell anyone she'd been there. She made supper and put the children's things away and sat in the sitting room with her mother and her sisters while her father read from the Bible, the same chapter he read every January, and she listened to his voice fill the room and thought about how much she loved that voice and how much that love was going to cost her one way or the other. She chose to stay. But not right away, not cleanly. She chose to stay after 6 more weeks of the most painful internal negotiation of her life. After conversations with Rebecca that left them both hollow-eyed and exhausted. After 2 more letters to Daniel, one confused, one clearer. After a night in February when she walked to the covered bridge alone in the dark and stood there for an hour in the cold without him present, just standing in the place where everything had happened, trying to hear what it was telling her. What she heard standing there in the February cold was this. She could leave. It was possible. She had a door held open. She had a man who would not pressure her and a life on the other side of the county line that was real and possible and within reach. She could walk through and it would not destroy her, but she would grieve this for a long time, maybe forever. And she would grieve it not because she'd been kept here, but because she loved it. Because the sound of her community's singing on a Sunday morning was one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard and she didn't want to lose access to it. Because her mother's hands kneading bread in the early light was something she needed to be near. Because her father, for all that he carried, was a man she loved with the full weight of her life and she was not prepared to look at him from the other side of a shunning. That was the honest thing. She needed to carry it back inside. She was not sure she could be someone who lived outside this community. Not because she'd been frightened into staying, and not because she was weak, but because the things she loved here were genuinely worth the things it cost. She just needed to finally, freely, choose them. There was one more thing she had to do before she wrote the final letter. She went to her mother. Not to confess everything. Her mother was a woman who survived by not knowing certain things, and Hannah understood this and did not consider it weakness. But she sat with her in the garden one afternoon in late February, the snow just beginning to soften at the edges, and she said, "Mama, how did you know?" Her mother looked up from the row she was clearing. "Know what? That this was the right life. That you weren't just that you were choosing it, not just accepting it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. She had a way of thinking that looked like stillness. Then she said, "I'm not sure I always knew. Some years I knew better than others." She brushed dirt from her gloves. "But I'll tell you what I did know. I knew what I would miss if I left, and I knew that what I would miss was bigger than what I was curious about." She looked at Hannah steadily. "That's a different thing from not having questions. I had questions. I just knew where my weight was." Hannah looked at her mother's face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the hands that had done every conceivable kind of work for decades and still knew how to be gentle. "Did you ever wonder," Hannah said carefully, "about a different life?" Her mother smiled. Not the reassuring smile, the real one. "Of course," she said. "That's not the question. The question is what you do with the wondering." Hannah nodded. She went home and wrote the last letter to Daniel that evening. She thanked him. She told him the truth, all of it, or as much as you can put in a letter. She told him he had given her something she didn't know how to name and wasn't sure she deserved and would carry her whole life. That he had shown her she was real in ways she hadn't known needed confirming. That she was going home not because she was afraid, and not because she was giving up anything that was truly hers, but because she had finally found the difference between the life she'd been handed and the life she was choosing, and the two turned out to be the same life. She told him she hoped he'd be happy. She meant every word. She never heard back. She told herself that was clean. That was the right kind of ending. A door that closed without a sound. She had walked away from it freely, and that was what mattered. But here is the thing she didn't know yet. Years passed the way years do in Amish country, measured not by months but by seasons, by harvests, by the slow accumulation of ordinary days that only reveal their shape when you step back and look at the whole of them. She was 20 when a young man named Samuel Graber began visiting her father. Quiet, good, with a dry humor that snuck up on you sideways. He asked her what she thought about things, genuinely asked, and listened to the answers. She didn't fall for him immediately. She was honest about that. But something opened in her, slowly, the way you open to spring after a long winter, not forgetting the cold but grateful for what it had taught you. She married Samuel 3 years later. He was the kind of man who noticed when she needed to be alone. The kind who didn't require her to be smaller than she was. She never told him about Daniel. Some things belong only to the season they happened in. She raised 4 children. She kept a garden people came from 3 counties to see. She became the kind of woman younger women came to when they were confused and frightened and didn't know who to tell. She always listened carefully. She never pretended to have answers she didn't have. She was by any measure a woman who had made her peace. Or so she thought. Until the summer her youngest daughter, Ruth, turned 17. It started at the county harvest auction. The same auction. The same wooden stalls. The same smell of hay and engine oil and baked goods set out on folding tables. Hannah was 51 years old, helping at the preserves table, the same way her mother had helped before her, and she was watching Ruth carry a crate across the yard when she saw the girl slow her steps. There was a young English man near the equipment stalls. He had dark hair pushed back from his forehead. He was talking to one of the Miller grandchildren, laughing easily, not performing anything for anyone. Ruth glanced at him, looked away, kept walking. Hannah went very still. She watched her daughter for the rest of that afternoon. The way Ruth's eyes drifted back twice, 3 times, without meaning to. The slight warmth in her face when she happened to walk past him with a tray. The careful way she kept her eyes down the next time. Hannah recognized every single thing she was watching. She had felt all of it herself, 33 years ago, at this same auction, wearing the same kind of dress, carrying the same kind of tray. She stood behind the preserves table, and something moved through her that she had no word for. It was not fear exactly. It was not grief exactly. It was the specific vertigo of watching your own life begin again inside someone you love, and knowing with the deep, quiet certainty of a woman who has already lived this, that you cannot protect them from it. You can only decide what to give them. She didn't say anything to Ruth that day, or the next. She went home and sat with it for 3 evenings, watching her daughter come in from chores, helping with supper, bowing her head for prayer, looking for signs of the same quiet war Hannah had fought inside herself at that age. The careful steadiness, the overcorrected posture, the eyes that were too focused on the plate. She saw all of it. On the 4th evening she asked Ruth to walk with her to the garden. They walked in the early dark, the fireflies just starting in the fields beyond the fence. Ruth was quiet in the way young people are quiet when they're waiting to see if an adult is about to tell them something or ask them something, and they're not sure which is worse. "I want to tell you something," Hannah said. "Something I've never told anyone except your Aunt Rebecca." Ruth looked at her. "When I was your age," Hannah said, "I fell in love with an Englishman." The silence that followed was absolute. Ruth had stopped walking. "His name was Daniel Marsh," Hannah said, carefully, the name strange after so many years of not saying it aloud. "He was kind. He was good. He never pushed me toward anything. And I loved him, and I chose to stay, and I do not regret the choice." She paused. "But I need you to hear all of that together, not just the part where I stayed." Ruth was watching her with an expression Hannah had never seen on her daughter's face before. Something cracked open and undefended. "I saw you at the auction," Hannah said quietly. "I know what I saw." Ruth said nothing for a long time. Then, "I've only spoken to him twice." "I know. I don't even know if I don't know what it is." "I know that too." Ruth looked out across the dark fields. Her jaw was tight. When she spoke again, her voice was young and frightened in a way that went straight through Hannah like cold air. "What do I do?" And Hannah, who had spent 33 years carrying the answer to this question, who had built a whole quiet life on the foundation of the choice she'd made, who had believed for decades that she knew what the right answer was, stood in the dark with her daughter and felt the question land in her chest fresh, as if she'd never answered it before. Because here is the painful truth she had never let herself fully hold. She had chosen the right life for herself. She believed that completely. Samuel was her match in every way that mattered. Her children were her joy. Her community was her home, and she had chosen it freely. None of that was a lie. But she had also spent 33 years not thinking too hard about the fact that she had never heard back from Daniel. That she had ended something real, without knowing whether he was broken by it or healed. That somewhere out there a man had held a door open for her, gently, with no conditions, and she had walked the other direction, and then never thought about whether the door had stayed open, or slowly, quietly closed. She had filed that away under things that could not be helped. But now her daughter was standing in front of her with that exact same look in her eyes, the open, terrified, already halfway in look. And Hannah understood something she had never quite let herself understand before. The choice she'd made at 18 had not been just hers. It had also been his, and she had never once in 33 years wondered what it had cost him. She stood in that dark garden for a long moment. Then she said to her daughter, "I can't tell you what to do. Nobody could tell me either, and I would not have thanked them if they'd tried." She turned to look at Ruth directly. "But I will tell you this. Whatever you feel, don't be ashamed of it. You didn't choose to feel it. You're not broken for feeling it. You are just a person who met another person, and that is not a sin." Ruth exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for days. And I will also tell you, Hannah continued, steadier now, that this community, your family, your faith, all of it, it is real, and it is worth something, and it is not a cage, not if you choose it with open eyes, but you have to choose it. Not because you're afraid, not because your grandfather is the bishop. She paused. Your grandfather is gone. This choice is yours. Ruth was crying quietly. She didn't seem to know it. Take your time, Hannah said. Be honest with yourself, and come to me when you need to, whatever you decide. She pulled her daughter close, and held her in the dark of the garden, and Ruth pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, and cried in the way young people cry when they finally have permission to, not dramatically, but with that deep, shuddering relief of someone who has been carrying something alone, and has finally been allowed to set it down. Hannah held her and said nothing more. She looked out over the dark fields, the same fields she had looked out over at 17, the same fireflies, the same summer smell of hay and black earth, the same silence pressing in from every direction. She thought about Daniel Marsh. She hoped he was well. She hoped, as she had always hoped, that his life was full and good. But standing there holding her daughter, she let herself feel for the first time, fully the weight of what she had never let herself feel before. She had been loved well by a man who deserved to be thought about, and she had closed a door on him and walked away and gotten very good at not looking back. That was the truth. The whole truth. Not a wound exactly, but not nothing. She could hold both things. The rightness of the choice she'd made, and the cost it had carried for someone who hadn't made a choice at all, who had only ever been patient and decent and open-handed with his heart. She had been worth that, she thought. She hoped she had. 3 weeks later, Ruth told her she had spoken to the English boy again, at the feed store in town, and that they had talked for 20 minutes, and that she had decided she wanted to understand what she was feeling before she acted on it, or buried it. Good, Hannah said. Is that enough? Ruth asked. Just to understand it? Understanding is where everything starts, Hannah said. The choice comes after. Ruth nodded slowly. She looked more like herself than she had in weeks, not resolved, but present. Not certain, but grounded. Hannah watched her go back to her chores and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, the late afternoon light falling across the floor in the particular golden way it does. Only in September in Lancaster County, the way it had fallen since Hannah was a girl, the way it would keep falling long after she was gone. She thought about her father, about the last time she had sat with him, years ago now. He had been very thin by then, the illness having taken most of his physical presence, leaving only the eyes still clear and still watching. He had held her hand and said, "You turned out well." "I tried," she said. And then he had said something she had not understood until this very moment, standing in her kitchen doorway, watching the September light. He had said, "The hardest thing about loving someone is letting them be fully themselves, and trusting that it won't destroy what you built together. Most people can't do it. You could." He paused. "Remember that when your children need you to." She had thought he was talking about Samuel, about her marriage. He wasn't. He had known about Daniel. He had always known, not the letters, not the bridge, not the specific details she had guarded so carefully, but he had known what it cost her. He had watched his eldest daughter stand at the edge of everything she'd been raised to be, and choose to step back from the cliff. Not out of fear, but out of love. And he had never said a word about it because he understood this man who had spent his whole life asking people to remain, that the greatest gift you could give someone was the room to make their own choice. He had given her that room. And now she was standing in her kitchen, in the September light, understanding 30 years late what her father had been trying to tell her. The tears came then, not the quiet, contained kind she had always been good at, real ones, sudden and ungraceful, the kind that catch you off guard when something you've been carrying for decades finally finds a place to put itself down. She stood there and cried for a few minutes in the empty kitchen. For Daniel, who had been good and kind and deserved to be grieved properly, even now, even this late. For her father, who had understood everything and said almost none of it. For her daughter, who was standing now at the same edge Hannah had stood at, about to learn what Hannah had learned, that some questions don't have right answers, only true ones. And for herself. For the 18-year-old girl with the letters under the Bible, and the steady hands and the perfect posture, who had been so good, so carefully good for so long, before she finally learned that goodness and wholeness are not the same thing. She wiped her face, she straightened, she started supper. Outside, Ruth was in the garden, pulling weeds the way her mother had taught her, the way her grandmother had taught Hannah, the way it had been done on this land for generations. Her cap was straight, her dress was the right length, Her hands were steady. From the kitchen window she looked exactly like a girl who knew exactly who she was. Hannah watched her for a moment. She knew better. She knew that underneath that stillness, underneath that careful steadiness, something was turning and turning in the dark. Something without a name yet. Something that was going to require more courage than anything Ruth had ever been asked for. And Hannah also knew this. Whatever Ruth decided, she would not have to carry it alone. She would have a mother who had been to that same edge and come back and built a real life on the other side. A mother who would tell her the truth, all of it, not just the comfortable parts. That was something. That was more than Hannah had been given. And maybe that was the only thing any of us can ever truly pass down. Not the choice we made, not the life we built, not even the love we kept or the love we let go, but the honesty to look at someone we love and say, here is what it cost, here is what it gave, here is what nobody told me, and I am telling you now, so you don't have to stand in the dark quite as alone as I did. Hannah Stoltzfus stood at her kitchen window in the September light, watching her daughter pull weeds in the garden, and she felt not peace exactly, not resolution, but something closer to the truth than either of those words. She felt completely, quietly, heartbreakingly human, and that in the end was enough. Subscribe because every story like this one ends with something you didn't expect to feel, and now you know why.